Thank you very much. Entschuldigen Sie, ich habe alles mein Deutsch vergessen und muss Englisch sprechen. Da. Over the last year, I've spoken at several conferences with titles such as The End of Fashion and Anti-Fashion, and now Missing Links, which does have a positive second title about creating value. But still, it's clear that we're at a moment where critical analysis of fashion seems to be growing. When I talked to colleagues of mine, I said, well, I'm going to be speaking about, the value of design and a panel that's talking about that. People were like, but that's obvious. The value of design is the designer, the creativity of the designer. They're creating new and exciting things. And then I said, and the responsibilities of the designer. And they said, what are those apart from staying in business and trying to be popular? So it's, Angela's talk was so relevant because most independent designers are struggling as hard as they can to survive. And of course, as we go to fashion shows, we see that although fashion's all about the new, it used to be every fall, winter, spring, summer. Now with fast fashion, it's sort of every 3 weeks you're waiting for new drop-offs. Most of what we see is not really very new. It's not really very creative. But I think that when you're considering the role of the designer in creating value in fashion, you're really led to one of the most mysterious aspects, which is the issue of creativity. And creativity is the phenomenon whereby something new is created. It could be in science, it could be in art, it could be in fashion. And most of us assume that something new is created by an individual. So in this case, for example, you look at, okay, this is Rei Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons, a really great creative talent in the world of fashion, and she did this all alone. Of course, it's more complicated than that. Obviously, Rei has her own history and her own identity. She studied aesthetics, both Western and Japanese. She went to London, saw what Vivienne Westwood was doing. She was close to Yohji Yamamoto. She created a whole world herself, but she didn't really do it alone. Every individual designer creates things in a context. Not just that she had really talented people working with her and has built an amazing team so that sometimes she allegedly can come in, bring a crumpled up piece of paper and put it on the table and say, right, I want you to start working on patterns that are inspired by this. Obviously, you need a great team for that. But beyond that, to succeed, a designer like Rei, like any designer, needs to find a resonating audience. So I'm going to quote to you from Alison Bancroft's book about psychoanalysis and fashion, where she writes how fashion involves both, quote, innovation in the surface decoration of the body and the wider social and cultural responses to this innovation. I think that's really important. It's not just that an individual or a group is creating something. There has to be the society which responds to it and in some way accepts it, buys it, wears it. Otherwise, it's not really fashion. So looking at this idea of building links as something that would be crucial to creativity, it's links with a lot of people. If you're thinking from the perspective of a young fashion designer who's come out in the world, links with other creatives, links with stylists, photographers, retailers, links also with customers. And in Rei's case, we all hear about how she came to Paris and stunned everyone with this fashion revolution, everything in black and deconstructed and oversized, and people were shocked by it. But she didn't just emerge out of a vacuum to appear in Paris. She'd already built a business in Tokyo, a very successful business with a large number of followers and customers who were known in Japan as the Crow tribe because they all went around in black. So when she appeared on the international agenda, she already had built a connection with others. So this link was there. Oops, sorry. Now, the fashion world has changed so much over the last half century and more. And two issues in particular have been highlighted as really instrumental in changing the life of designers, not just since Dior's time, but even since the time when Ray first appeared. And those two are globalization and technology. Now, as a historian, I have to tell you, neither of those are new influences on fashion. Globalization has been an influence on fashion for a very long time, hundreds of years. You imagine all those calicos smuggled into England. And technology for equally as long, the spinning jenny and the mechanical loom, all of these things have. Fashion has been especially a global industry for the last sort of 100 years. When you have Paris and the haute couture at the pinnacle of a kind of world system. And so when Dior launched the new look in '47, this was copied by women as far away as Tokyo and New York. So this was an international phenomenon. The fashion system is obviously really different today, but in some respects there are a lot of similarities. Dior emerged in Paris, and within today's global fashion system, the main actors with decision-making powers, the creative and operational heads of all of the big companies, specialist producers, flagship stores, are overwhelmingly concentrated in a few world cities like Paris, London, and New York. Nevertheless, the whole center-periphery map has been dislocated by the emergence of a variety of other fashion cities, marked most conspicuously by fashion weeks all over the world, from Moscow to Mumbai, from Seoul to Sao Paulo. You could probably spend an entire year just traveling from one fashion show to another around the world. I often thought if I didn't have a job, that might be an interesting experiment. But I've been to quite a few of these, and they're really very, very different, and different not only in the question of the clothes that are produced and the atmosphere, but in terms of the engagement with the local audience. So, for example, in New Zealand, people there, the designer said, a lot of New Zealand people really like to buy New Zealand clothes. You go to Mexico City, the designers tell you, nobody is buying our clothes. They all want to buy European clothes. And so some of the shows, nothing is ever produced. But the idea of a creative city as being important as a branding notion for a nation is becoming more and more prevalent. Every country wants to have at least one fashion city and a fashion week. Sometimes it becomes divided, so it's Beijing versus Shanghai or Mumbai versus Sao Paulo. This has a history too. In Italy, it was Rome versus Florence before Milan finally triumphed. It brings cachet to the city and the country. It helps brand it as being creative, and it has economic advantages, even if they have very limited sales. And we did an exhibition a few years ago called Global Fashion Cities, and we looked at things, in Lagos in Nigeria, in Seoul, and St. Petersburg, and Kiev. And it was really fascinating because in some places it was quite a lively system and was really catching on and becoming important for people there. In other places, not so much, but the desire was there to have it. So this is something you have to take account of. And it's obviously much easier to be a young emerging designer in one of the major fashion capitals. It's hard enough. You come out of Central St. Martin's, or you come out of FIT, it's still hard to get any kind of job. But imagine it's that much harder if you're coming out of a fashion school in New Delhi and you're thinking, what do I have to do? I have to try and make a success here, then maybe show in London, then if I'm super lucky I can move and show in Paris. You have this kind of idealized trajectory where you move closer to the center. And in a lot of ways, I think that the four big fashion capitals are already too many. Everybody kept saying to me, well, what's going to be the fifth one? Was it going to be Tokyo? Well, that didn't pan out. All the best Japanese designers went to Paris. Was it going to be Seoul? Was it going to be Shanghai? Was it going to be Kiev? In fact, it's too long. The journalists and the buyers are traveling for a month. The last thing they want is to go to another city. But there would be potential, perhaps, for regional capitals that would attract, if not buyers and journalists from around the world, at least regionally. And so there have been attempts to try and do this. Tokyo's attempted this, Shanghai. It hasn't quite gelled anywhere. And I suspect it's because it's the wrong people choosing, or because you could potentially have people from Bangkok and Jakarta and Seoul and Shanghai and Tokyo showing in one place to have a sort of pan-Asian capital, but it hasn't worked out. Then there's the whole question of copying, which has been around since fashion was around. Here, we like to show these at FIT because it's one of the original Chanel couture suit, and then a copy which was produced for the department store Orbox. And they were shown in the windows of Orbox side by side with the prices, which was something like $450 versus $24. But the material's the same, the workmanship's not the same, but the buttons are the same, etc. It was all done on licensing between Chanel and Orbox. Nowadays, of course, everything is produced and shown almost instantly. So when you get the fashion show, it's not just that we all see it and want to get the clothes right away and have them dropped off, but all the fast fashion producers see it as well and then copy it and get it into the stores long before the original creators do. So this has caused a great sort of uproar in fashion, endless discussions. Can regular designers do it faster too? Can they have see now, buy now? All kinds of attempts to deal with the customer who's now been trained to want to get clothes within a couple of weeks after seeing them, and hardly wants to even wait that long. So this is an additional challenge for designers. So the independent designer is really squeezed, on the one hand, between the big luxury houses like H&M and Chanel, and on the other hand, squeezed from below by the big fast fashion companies like H&M and Zara. So there's a shrinking part of the market which has any possibility for anybody buying in there. Then, of course, you have, as we've heard over and over again, the whole issue of the exploitation of labor, most conspicuously in countries like Bangladesh and Cambodia. But as Angela pointed out, even the prestigious graduates of Central St. Martin's and great fashion schools are finding themselves exploited, working desperately so as to be able to say that they're a designer, but they're not at the pinnacle the way they all imagine they're going to be. So that you go to fashion school and you think, I'm going to be, if not the next Karl Lagerfeld, then at least the next, name the trendy person of the day, the next Joseph Altuzarra, somebody who's going to be recognized. And this doesn't usually happen. And again, this is the negative thing that you really hate to say to fashion students, because it's kind of, the odds are against you, sweetie. They're really seriously against you. And they're even more against, certain students who don't have any kind of capital backing. Sometimes you see rich students whose fathers keep pouring money into their company, but even the richest father, after a while, will say, it's just melted away. It's melted away and you don't have a business. So what do they do? Sorry. In other words, the speed of fashion is not just something which is affecting fast fashion. It's affecting all designers, and it has a tremendously negative effect on them. So as fashion accelerates, it's being blamed for more and more problems within the fashion world. So that, John Galliano's public meltdown, Alexander McQueen's suicide, these are all discussed in the fashion industry, or were over the last couple of years. Is it because of all of this stress that it has to be newness, it has to be now? As Susie Menkes wrote, find this, if we accept that the pace of fashion was part of the problem behind the decline of John Galliano, the demise of Alexander McQueen, and the cause of other well-known rehab cleanups, nonstop shows seem a high price to pay for the endless newness demanded of fashion now. The strain on both budgets and designers is heavy. And yet, when Women's Wear Daily went around asking designers, is it going too fast for you? Almost invariably they said, no, I like the speed, I can keep up with it. Nobody wants to be seen as a loser complaining that, I'm struggling to keep up with this. So you get a situation where the life of a designer, let alone the life of a factory operative or a part-time retail worker, is like sort of factory farming. I mean, you're churning out more and more and more stuff. And even the creative workers are struggling to keep up. So it's a very far cry from this ideal that students have that I'm going to be sketching brilliant things and people will recognize my brilliance and then I'll be rich and famous. Instead, you seem to be caught in this terrible, terrible treadmill. And of course, even decades ago, Moschino had this incredibly effective advertisement about stop the fashion system because it seemed that it's going out of whack. What can you do with it? This tension between the fact that we love fashion in so many ways, and yet there seem to be so many things wrong with our actual experience of fashion. And of course, as we've heard over and over, it's not just fashion, it's electronics, it's all kinds of objects. There's too much of them being produced. But because fashion seems to people so superfluous, that it's all really about pleasure and novelty and aesthetics, it doesn't seem that they're making improvements. At least you can justify to yourself that your new iPhone that you're buying every 8 months is better than the old iPhone. You can't logically say that your new sweater is any better than your old sweater. It's probably not. It's just newer. It's maybe a different color. So Elizabeth Wilson put it really well when she says, the thesis is that fashion is oppression. The antithesis is that we find it pleasurable. So this whole issue of creativity came to really interest me a lot over the last couple of years. And I always recommend to everybody to read the book Creativity by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian researcher, where he talks about how, and I'll quote, the level of creativity in a given place at a given time does not only depend on the amount of individual creativity. It depends as much on how well suited the respective domains and fields are to the recognition and diffusion of novel ideas, end quote. So a domain is like a set of symbolic rules and practices. So mathematics is a domain, and fashion's a domain. And then a field comprises all those individuals who act as gatekeepers, the ones who judge whether something is good, who'll say, oh my God, Einstein, that is a brilliant idea. We no one thought of that. And the gatekeepers in fashion who go, oh my God, that's a brilliant idea, and who start rating the young designers. That was an A graduate runway show by this design student. That one, we're not going to mention it. So from the very beginning, you start to be graded A-list, B-list by these gatekeepers. Why am I showing you this picture? Because if you think of the Italian Renaissance and you think, was it just by chance that suddenly there were all these great artistic geniuses who popped up in this little city in the middle of Florence? You know, genetics doesn't work that way. It's really more a question of the situation at that time and place that encouraged painters to create new things because they had buyers. They had clients who were willing to say, okay, that's an interesting idea. I like the way you're doing that. Do another one. Or so-and-so got that picture by Botticelli. I want one by him. I'm going to commission it. So in other words, it's not just a question of the creativity of the artist or the designer. It's also the surrounding and the environment and how well anyone can accept it. To go back to Dior, it's not just that it was a simpler fashion world. Paris was in terrible shape in '47. After years of Nazi occupation, this was a success because a whole lot of gatekeepers and clients around the world really responded strongly and positively to a dramatically new, ultra-feminine, luxurious fashion. They wanted that. And also it wasn't completely out of the blue because in '38, '39, other designers have been experimenting with this. It just got put on ice for 4 years or 5 years austerity, wartime fashion, and then suddenly it blossomed back. And also, a lot of gatekeepers and customers had a lot invested in the idea that they wanted Paris to succeed again. They were waiting for Paris to come back. You know, they'd put up with their own designers in the interim, but they wanted Paris. So all those things worked together to make it a success. It's the same with any designer now. There has to be this confluence of people who want what they're doing. You take someone like Lee Alexander Mcqueen. Now, he's always said how his collections were all about, they were about himself, how he worked out his issues, his problems, his sexuality in the collections. On the other hand, he's also the product of a particular culture and society. So, yes, he grew up gay in a working class neighborhood in London in an era when AIDS was emerging when he was a young teenager. So a very particular setting. And he apprenticed on Savile Row. He worked in Italy. He worked in theatrical design. He got to go to Central St. Martin's. So he acquired a wide range of specific fashion knowledge about fashion techniques, about fashion history, about what different designers were doing around the world. And then he was also encouraged, both at school, where he was a very aggressive student, and later encouraged to try and assess not just new ideas, but the next step, which ideas are better than others? Because, you know, everyone, it's like opinions. Everyone has opinions. You want opinions? Ask a cab driver. It doesn't mean they're all equal. Some are better than others. Some are based on something and resonate. So he gets that kind of feedback. And I think because at that particular time and place, as Mcqueen was emerging, he was emerging at a time when fashion, there was starting to be excitement in fashion again. And he was picked up, of course, famously first by Givenchy. He developed people who were following him because he identified with sex and gender victims, because he identified with a kind of aesthetic of beauty and terror. These things appealed to other cohorts within the society. And he was able, despite being extremely shy and extremely aggressive, a very difficult personality, he was able to acquire allies and supporters. Some of those gatekeepers who started saying, this is somebody important. I mean, I remember the one time I met Alexander Mcqueen was when he had done a collection for Rufo Research, the leather company. So he was still quite young, and there were a bunch of different designers at Saks Fifth Avenue. And I was there with a student of mine, and she said, oh my God, there's Alexander Mcqueen, you have to speak to him. And I said, I can't speak to him, it's Alexander Mcqueen. And she's like, you have to, go. So I went over and I said, hi, Mr. Mcqueen, I'm Valerie Steele, I really admire your work. And then he said, yes, I've seen you on TV. And then we both kind of backed away from each other shyly and wandered off. And then it occurred to me afterwards, he'd probably seen me on a TV show in England saying, he's fucking brilliant, he's such a great designer. But, you know, so these kind of networks form in a variety of different ways. And he was able to be picked up by them, despite many people being terrified of him. I mean, I've had fashion journalists who said they were so scared of him. He was so aggressive. Then creativity also seems to involve a kind of diversity of people. And we like to think of the creative fashion industry as being a diverse crowd. But as people have pointed out, we're not as diverse as we could be. We did a show on black fashion designers recently at FIT, which is one of the most popular ones ever. And people came in and they were practically weeping, and they're like, we never heard of these designers. We didn't know they were around, that they've been around for years, that they've been existing and producing. Because if you go on Vogue.com, you know, sort of like 1% of the designers listed are actually black. So the more diverse you can make a community, whether it's a laboratory or an atelier, the more likely it is that you'll be getting diverse ideas and create more creative innovations. So as Csikszentmihalyi says, centers of creativity tend to be at the intersections of different cultures, where beliefs, lifestyles, and knowledge mingle and allow individuals to see new combinations of ideas with greater ease. And then he compares that. He says, it's cultures that are uniform and rigid. It takes a much greater investment of attention to achieve new ways of thinking. So the more that the atelier is just a homogeneous group of people, no matter how creative they might be individually, they're still going to be seeing things from somewhat the same way. So a good fashion school would try and mix people in and would try and get different kinds of people to come. Another thing that Iris van Herpen's been good at sort of trying to bring together different domains. So physics and fashion, for example, different scientific discoveries in fashion. I myself noticed when I brought together, sort of queer history and fashion history, new ideas emerged. Or when I brought together dance and fashion, new ideas emerged that I hadn't thought of just thinking in terms of fashion history. Some of the best shows involved that kind of thing. When I did my Gothic fashion show, it wasn't that I was just looking at designers like Rick Owens and Mcqueen and Yoji, but I had hordes of goth kids coming up to see me. I was like frantically watching old, terrible vampire movies from the 70s and listening to music that I hadn't heard for decades and trying to get different worlds together. So I guess the main point I'm making is, if creativity is going to flourish in today's fashion world, we need a couple of things beyond just designers who are taught to be creative. We need a critical mass of knowledgeable people who come together to share ideas and judge which ideas are best. One of the things that's so good about this kind of conference is it is a temporary laboratory, a temporary network where people can hear what some of the issues are being raised are. So conferences are one area. But to try and maximize times when you can bring together a critical mass of people. And then to try and foster an environment within which everybody's creativity can flourish. So again, to try and, if you want people to appreciate what's special about a particular designer's clothing, they have to be able to see what's different between that and kind of a mass market copy. And this has to be learned.